Welcome back. In tonight's Auto Watch, tension continues to build between the UAW and the Big Three automakers as they're less than 2 weeks away from their contracts expiring and a possible strike. Union leadership says Ford is the only company to submit a counteroffer, which they harshly rejected.
In addition to that, UAW President Shawn Fain said the union has filed unfair labor practice charges against GM and Stellantis for failing to respond to their demands in a timely manner. He said the companies are not dealing in good faith, which both companies have since pushed back on in statements.
For more insight on the latest on the contract negotiations, our Wayne State Management Professor Merrick Masters, as well as former UAW spokesperson Brian Rothenberg. Thank you both for being here tonight.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Well, the union has rejected the Ford contract. Why do you think Fain is so harshly criticizing this deal? Why do they appear to be so far apart at this point, 2 weeks out?
Well, it's far less than he anticipated, far less than they want. And at the same time, he's very disappointed, I think, in the progress of negotiations across all three companies, but most particularly at GM and Stellantis, which he thinks have been stonewalling to the point where they violated the National Labor Relations Act, and he's been compelled, in his mind, to file unfair labor practice charges.
Isn't this par for the course, Brian? What do you think? Is the union asking for much more than it knows it's going to get, and is Ford offering much less than they know is going to be accepted?
Well, keep in mind, Shana, so, this is the first offer. I don't know anybody that would ever pick the first offer and settle right off of that. Secondly, there's a lot more at play here because the new way of negotiating, and I'm sure Merrick and a lot of academics are going to study this for years to come, is that they're doing this publicly. So you have, President Fain come out and indicate that GM and Stellantis have not bargained in good faith because they haven't given an offer. They're probably coming up with some kind of a theory on how they can present it in the best way because they're not used to this style of bargaining. And then you have Ford, which actually came out with their initial economic proposal, and it got rejected. That would have all happened behind closed doors in past years. And so therefore, I think the companies and the union are sort of adjusting to it. We'll have to see how this plays out. The good news, and I think Merrick will tell you this, is that they have heard pieces of what President Fain has talked about. They have done some movement. They understand they need to do something on in progression, employees. They understand they need to do something on temporary workers, at least in the Ford proposal. And they understand they have to do something on COLA. But this is just a proposal. This is nowhere near where we're going to be in 2 weeks. And even if we go on strike, this is nowhere near where the final proposal will be.
Brian, I want to ask you something here. Fain is filing these unfair labor practice charges against GM and Stellantis. He is calling it insulting, counterproductive, and illegal. In your opinion and in your line of work from what you did with the UAW, is what is going on here, is this illegal?
Well, it's hard to bargain when you don't have a proposal yet, on the one hand, and so the Department of Labor is going to have to determine that. If they do find an unfair labor practice, it makes it much harder to bring in replacement workers. That's one of the main things to know if the Department of Labor finds that. I think ultimately the one thing that could happen is that the federal government steps in and may try to put a gag order on this public bargaining. I don't know that they'll be able to do that initially, but I think that part of this could head toward that, especially if they bring in some federal mediators.
Merrick, as Brian noted, this is a different situation than we've typically seen. What would these final 2 weeks typically be like in the previous era?
Well, they would be probably not too different in terms of how far apart they are at this stage. But they would be doing it behind closed doors. And really, it's at the last hour that you get the settlements. And they narrow the issues down to a handful of issues that are handled by a handful of people in a closed room right before the deadline. If they're able to get an agreement, they reach a strike. They avoid a strike. If they're not, then they typically in the past might grant an extension in the contract and say, we'll continue to bargain if you're close. But Shawn Fain apparently has foreclosed that as an option, saying that this is a hard and fast deadline. Who knows what will happen when they finally get up to that point. But the situation with Stellantis and GM is a little bit different. And Brian's right. I mean, this has legal implications because you can't permanently replace an unfair labor practice striker. You can permanently replace an economic striker.
Both of the companies are rejecting Fain's claims, saying that they're doing anything illegal, and they claim they are working in good faith. But how bad of a sign is it that we're at this point, 2 weeks out essentially, less than 2 weeks out, and they still don't have offers from GM and Stellantis?
Well, he's sending a clear signal that they're going to have to prove that they're engaging in good faith bargaining, because it's going to go to the National Labor Relations Board and they're going to have a hearing, and they could rule that it's an unfair labor practice strike. That would probably be appealed to the Court of Appeals and may not be decided for a long period of time. Not enough to affect these negotiations, but should there be a strike, should there be replacements, then it would have real implications.
Now, how do the unfair labor practice charges affect these next 2 weeks? Do we expect an offer to come on the table, or is everything essentially frozen?
No, they can continue to negotiate as if there were no charges filed.
Okay.
And I would think that if they really wanted a deal, they would buckle down and not listen to all the rhetoric and focus on the issues. The only thing that's going to move things off the dime is if they make substantive proposals that bring them closer.
Hearing Fain last night and seeing the statements come out from the Big Three, it seems like tensions are really as high as they have ever been. Is there any possible way, do you think, they could settle something and get on the same page before the deadline and avoid a strike?
Well, I think Brian alluded to this. The tensions that go on behind the scenes are far greater than this. So this is a little bit bargaining in public in a mild form. They can get pretty heated in their discussions, and I would expect that the closer they get, the more heated it'll become, and they can't really let these public displays interfere with what they're trying to do, making real progress at the table.
At this point, do you think a strike may be likely with one or two of the companies, or are all three looking likely?
I wouldn't want to place a bet on that right now. There's a distinct possibility of the strike. I hope there's enough time for them to at least reach agreement with one company that'll be a template for the other two.
Sure.
Well, Professor Merrick Masters and former UAW spokesperson Brian Rothenberg, who joined us over Zoom, we appreciate both of you being here tonight.